So there I was, on an island in the Caribbean, laying on a beach at a private resort, reading a book on the history of inequality. This is not a joke. I certainly wish it was, but sadly it's true. During sabbatical, my wife and I went to the island of St. Lucia, and while I was there, I read a book, The Dawn of Everything. It's a 526-page tome written by two British anthropologists with a bright fluorescent orange cover. The exquisite irony of an entitled white American reading a book about inequality while lying on a beach in the Caribbean was not lost on me while I was there. I did think about how ridiculous I must have looked. But I've grown so accustomed to looking ridiculous at this point in my life that I thought, what does it matter? Just lean into it. You are a super nerd, and you are reading a huge book on vacation. Embrace it. You can day drink all the mojitos you want, and nothing is ever going to change that. The real dilemma for me, though, was that I could not put the book down. Perhaps it was being far away from home as an outsider in a strange land among the ancestors of the Arawak and Hiwanora people. Whatever it was, I was captivated by the way the authors of this book used examples of critiques of European society by indigenous people. I'd never read them before. It was a shock to the conscience. A French priest, Father Baird, assigned to evangelize the Mi'kmaq Nation in Nova Scotia, once commented, "The native people tell us you're always fighting and quarreling among yourselves. We live peaceably. You are envious and slander each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbors." Similarly, the people of the Wendat or Huron Nation were particularly offended by the lack of generosity that they observed among the French. A friar named Gabriel Sagard said, "The Wendat reciprocate hospitality and give enough assistance to each other that there are no beggars. Everyone is provided for in their communities." And they considered it an atrocity when they heard that there were a great many needy beggars in France and thought it was for lack of charity in us and blamed us for it severely. In 1703, an indigenous leader named Candinarok offered the deepest criticism, saying, "I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and I can't think of a single way that they act that is not inhuman. And I genuinely think that this can only be the case as long as they stick to their distinctions of mine and thine. What you call money in European society is the devil of all devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls, the slaughterhouse of the living." He went on to imagine that one can live in the country of money and preserve one's souls is like imagining that one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money, he said, is the father of luxury, lasciviousness, intrigues, trickery, lies, betrayal, insincerity, of all the world's worst behavior. Fathers sell their children, husbands their wives, wives betray their husband, brothers kill each other, friends are false, and all because of money. In the light of all this, he said, "Tell me that we Wendat are not right in refusing to touch or so much as look at your silver." Amazingly, Candinarok asked his European friends, "Do you seriously imagine that I would be happy to live as one of the inhabitants of Paris, to take 2 hours every morning just to put on my shirt and makeup, to bow and scrape before every obnoxious galoot that I meet on the street who happen to be born with inheritance?" he said. "Do you really imagine that I could carry a purse full of coins and not immediately hand them out to people who are hungry?" He said, if you just abandoned these conceptions of mine and thine, such distinction between people would dissolve. A leveling equality would take place among you as it does among the Wendat people. I've set before you these qualities that we believe define humanity: wisdom, reason, equality, and demonstrated that the existence of separate material interests knocks all of these on their head. As I read this book, I realized that time and again, the indigenous have tried to show Europeans how we are living in the midst of a story of separation. What captivated me most, though, is the similarity between what the indigenous leaders said to the Europeans and what Jesus said to the Pharisees. Immediately before he told this parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Luke tells us that the Pharisees were lovers of money and heard Jesus speaking and scoffed at him. So Jesus said to them, you justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God. Then he told this famous story, whose message is both terrifying and extremely clear. Hoarding wealth while ignoring the poor has catastrophic consequences in this life and the next, on earth as it is in heaven. It's not clear in this story if Jesus actually believed in a literal hell, but it is obvious that he was willing to use the Pharisees' belief in the afterlife against them. The crazy thing about this story is that Lazarus didn't want to get in the rich man's house. He didn't want his purple clothes. He didn't even want his fancy linen underwear made from Egyptian cotton. That's what fancy linen was used for in those days. And he didn't even want his daily feast. All Lazarus wanted were the scraps that fell from the rich man's table, just the crumbs. Like the Canaanite woman, he knew that even dogs got to eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. But not Lazarus. Lazarus was treated worse than a dog. He was not simply absent from the rich man's table, he was on the menu. Lazarus was starving outside while the rich man's dogs were making a meal out of him, licking his sores, a humiliating form of relief. Lazarus lived in an economy where even the wealthiest people could only afford a fatted calf and feast occasionally. But the rich man in this story feasted on a daily occasion, yet still would not share or offer leftovers or even throw scraps to poor Lazarus. The world that Lazarus found himself in was not unlike our own today. A 2016 report from the Congressional Budget Office shows that while total family wealth has more than doubled over the last 30 years to $67 trillion, most average families haven't seen a nickel of that gain. In fact, the typical American family has actually lost wealth between 1989 and 2013 when we adjust for inflation. By contrast, people in the upper reaches of American society and the economy have done fantastic. Families in the top 10% have seen their wealth increase by an average of 153%. And the top 1% have done the best of all, taking their overall share of the nation's wealth from 31% in '89 to 42% today. The gap between the rich and the poor is larger than ever. Inequality is vast. Disparity is growing. We're living in that story of separation, a story that feels as great today as the chasm that separated the rich man from Lazarus in death. Over the years as a pastor, I've had many different encounters and experiences and relationships with the poor. I've come to work at the church to find people sleeping outside the building, and I've had church leaders, unfortunately, try to get me to call the police to have them removed. I've given away church benevolence funds directly to the poor to help people pay bills and cover rent, fix their cars, buy food for their families, spent hours with social workers and nonprofit directors discussing the best ways to try to help people in need. I've read countless books and research about economic disparity, the causes of poverty, how we can fix the problems. And every experience I've had and every expert that I've talked to over the years has taught me the same thing over and over again, that I should never give cash to the poor. Never, under any circumstances. They said it's better to give to a shelter or a nonprofit organization or an organization that's providing services. They say that the poor aren't going to use the money well, that they'll buy alcohol or cigarettes or drugs, that giving money to people on the street causes a dependency that actually hurts people. They say that what the poor need is a job, not money. That what I should do is to give to what makes the greatest impact and not for sentimental reasons to make myself feel better as I'm driving down the street. Some even call it toxic charity. I know you've heard that term. Psychologist Robert Lupton even said, never do for the poor what they can do for themselves. Giving to people who could be gaining from their own initiative may be the kindest way to destroy them. So for years, I must confess, I stopped carrying cash. And even when I did have it, I wouldn't give it to the poor. And I felt very justified in my decision, Could rationalize to myself saying that this is based on the advice of experts. People have told me, don't do this. It's bad for folks. But then as I was driving in the car, my daughter started asking why we weren't giving money to people on the streets anymore. So I started keeping cash again. Just giving it to whoever I see. I'm not proud of myself for this. Honestly, I'm just being selfish. I'm too terrified by this parable not to give money away. I'm not going to be the Pharisee and religious leader who drives by and ignores poor Lazarus just because I read Robert Lupton. It's not worth the risk, is it? There's a grammatical error in verse 20 here that we often overlook, which really changes the meaning of the story. The verb is not lay, that Lazarus lay, but that Lazarus was laid. Something very easy to miss in an English translation. But it means that Lazarus did not lay down at the rich man's gate of his own accord. He was put there by someone else. The verb might mean that Lazarus' hunger and sickness had made him unable to walk, or that Lazarus might have been disabled, which resulted in his poverty. Either way, the fact that Lazarus was laid at the rich man's gate reflects a common practice of community care in the Middle East at the time. Because he was the wealthiest person in the town, people believed that the rich man had the greatest responsibility to meet the needs of the poor. So every day, the members of the community would carry Lazarus to the gate of the rich man's house in the hopes that he would be moved by compassion and generosity. And it never happened, not even once. They were as proximate to each other as family, but the relational chasm that separated the rich man from Lazarus was as wide as the east is from the west. He was living in that story of separation. And so were the Pharisees, which is why Jesus told this story. And we might imagine that they were calloused and heartless and money-grubbing jerks. But history reveals to us a much more complex picture of the Pharisees. They did care about the poor, especially about the ability of the poor to borrow money. Jewish laws of sabbatical and jubilee made creditors very hesitant to lend money to the poor in the 6th year and the 49th, because the next year, the debts had to be forgiven by law. So the poor were in a difficult position. If there was no money to borrow because the creditors wouldn't lend them, the poor had no money and they couldn't survive. So the most respected Pharisee of the day came up with a solution, Rabbi Hillel, a contemporary of Jesus, to try to bridge the gap between the creditors and the debtors with a special clause, a special new loan, a clause in a loan called a prosbul, a waiver, that the poor could sign to surrender their rights to forgiveness, giving the creditors a guarantee that their loans would be paid even in the sabbatical year, even in the Jubilee. So it's difficult to argue that the Pharisees didn't care about the poor. They created this clause for that very purpose. But the problem is Jesus taught the opposite of Hillel. He did not attempt to bridge the gap between creditors and debtors, rich and poor, with a fancy new kind of loan. He suggested radical generosity would bridge the gap. To the creditors, he said, lend without expecting to get repaid. And to the debtors, he said, your debts have been forgiven. One of the most striking aspects of Jesus' teaching is that he does not specify how to give to the poor. He just says over and over again that we should. He also never told his followers or the Pharisees that we should give money to the poor for the sake of the poor. He provided only one reason we should give to the poor, and that is for our own benefit. Not financially, of course, as you may have heard in other churches, but spiritually. We've been trained to see the Pharisees as legalistic and self-righteous, but Jesus saw them as lovers of money, and the major dispute that he had with them was over the question of what makes a person pure and holy. The Pharisees believed that purity was derived from the observance of the laws of table fellowship and keeping the Sabbath, but Jesus believed purity was derived from hospitality to strangers and giving to the poor. In fact, the Hebrew word for justice is the root of the word for giving alms, basically the same word. Jesus believed there was something sacred and purifying about giving alms to the poor that saves us and makes us whole by connecting us to them. Problem is, the Hebrew word for holy also means to be set apart. So the Pharisees in their mind had believed that holiness was equivalent to separateness. But Jesus overturned the definition of holiness from an individual to a social and communal concept. For Jesus, to be set apart was not about separation, but solidarity. It was not to be set apart, but to be set in relationship, to be given the calling and the responsibility to love. It would be easy to say that the problem with the Pharisees and the rich man was greed, loving money more than God and people, which it says in Timothy is the root of all evil. It might even be tempting to say that the problem with the Pharisees and the rich man was indifference, which Elie Wiesel said is the opposite of love. But there's something more fundamental than greed and indifference at work in this parable. In his book, The Ascent of Humanity, author Charles Eisenstein wrote, "There is a common root underneath the diverse crisis of our modern age. Underlying the vast swath of ruin of our civilization is not human nature, but the opposite: humanity denied. This denial of human nature rests upon an illusion, a misconception of a self and the world. We have divined ourselves as other than we are, as discrete subjects, separate from each other, separate from the world around us. Saints and mystics," he says, "have tried for thousands of years to teach us how we are trapped in a delusion about who we are, and yet we think separation is a good thing. It's freedom, it's independence, and an ascent in which we have risen above our animal origins." But whether it's separation from God, creation, or other people, what Eisenstein shows is that the ideology of separation has generated the converging crisis of our world today. It has made us what we are and threatens now to destroy us. As for money, Eisenstein claims it is the instrument, not the cause, but the instrument by which our separation from nature, spirit, love, beauty, justice, peace, and community approaches its maximum. When we are immersed in the logic of money, we actually see separation as a positive. But separation is an illusion. It's a lie. The reality is we are not separate from God or creation or other people. We are deeply connected with everyone and everything. If the pandemic taught us anything, it's that what happens to one affects another. As Dr. King said, we are caught in that inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We cannot be whole or integrated human beings without each other, without creation, without God. Eisenstein suggests that the only solution to the lie of separation is what he calls the deep medicine of interbeing. The ability to embody the full reality that we are not independent of one another or creation or God, but completely and totally interdependent, cosmically and biologically bound up together, not separate, but symbiotic. And this is what we come to celebrate every time we practice communion and come to the table. We remember our inescapable connectedness to each other, to God, to creation, and we receive the deep medicine of interbeing. Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus was an attempt to shock the Pharisees and all of us out of the lie of separation. Not only to see the poor and be filled with generosity, but to understand the fundamental ways we are connected to each other, rich and poor and everyone in between. I once heard a relief worker say, "Poverty is not the absence of money, but the absence of friendship." This is far more than a trite cliche. A new comprehensive study released last month, entitled The Determinants of Economic Connectedness, shows that a key to reducing poverty is more friendships between rich and poor. Over the last 4 decades, the financial circumstances into which children have been born have increasingly determined where they ended up as adults. But this new study has uncovered a powerful exception to that pattern. For poor children, research found, living in an area where people have more friendships that cut across class lines significantly increased how much they earned in adulthood. Furthermore, the study found that if poor children grew up in neighborhoods where 70% of their friends were wealthy, it increased their future incomes by 20%. These cross-class friendships had a stronger impact than anything else, than school quality, family structure, job availability, or a community's racial composition. Call it social capital if that's what you want. But the people you know make all the difference. The separation at the beginning and the end of Jesus' parable is a lie. Just as Pablo Picasso said, art is a lie that enables us to realize the truth. The truth is we're all connected, which is why we don't carry cash or give away cash for the sake of poor Lazarus. We carry it for ourselves. We carry it for the sake of our souls and our salvation. We carry it because our hearts need it. We carry it so that whenever the opportunity presents itself, we can give something to remember that we are not separate. We are connected to everyone, everywhere. What happens to you happens to me. We are all one family. We are forever linked. We are a communion. We are not separate. Separation is an illusion. Separation is a lie. Symbiosis is the truth, and solidarity is the goal. Holiness is not being separate, but being in relationship, welcoming strangers, sharing food, giving to the poor. These are the rituals that purify our hearts, make us holy, and build beloved community. So with everything we have to do everything we can to remember our unbreakable unity with each other and with the poor, and refuse to forget that truth or to exist in any other way. We must reject the story of separation every day and find a way to write a new story, a story where all people have the power to live together, united in equality and peace. Perhaps we need a new story that begins something like this. On the night he was arrested and betrayed, Jesus said, "Take, eat this bread in remembrance of me." Amen.